Well, good morning again. It is a pleasure to lead you in worship, without a doubt. For Christians, would you say that praying, trusting, and following are important characteristics of a life of faith? Praying, trusting, following, important characteristics of a life of faith, yet we don't always. So the art of praying, trusting, and following can be summed up in our Lenten series in one word. The road sign that's used to depict the sign of God at work in the world is to yield. It's a yield sign this morning. So how are you at maneuvering through a roundabout? Some smiles on your faces. I live over here. I see some of you drive. The roundabout on Lakeshore. I go through that roundabout several times a day because I'm just live a couple blocks away from it. And it never ceases to amaze me how I'm in the roundabout. I'm traveling. I have the right of way. And someone comes sailing down Lakeshore, doesn't even look, and sails right into the roundabout as if they own the road. So what am I tempted to do? No, don't answer that. I saw some of your faces. No, I'm not thinking. I'm tempted to step on the gas. Because it's the only thing I got. I can't honk the horn. I can't react fast enough. But I got my foot on the pedal. And I'm ready to just lay on it and teach a lesson, right? I don't, but that's my guttural instinct. How are you when you're in a line of traffic that is barely crawling along, and there's someone on the side, they have a yield sign, you have the right of way, and you're thinking to yourself, gosh, I should really let them in the space that's in front of me because we're barely traveling along here. And all of a sudden, while you're debating whether you should or shouldn't in your mind, you haven't, and you're now past them, and you're thinking, oops, sorry about that. And then it goes through your mind, you're thinking, well, they should have to wait their turn just like I did, right? Except then you realize that someone let you in. And you're thankful at that moment that you don't have a Christian bumper sticker on your car, right? Okay, maybe that's just me. When was the last time you were stubborn? When's the last time you clung to your own desires rather than yielding to what might have been the best? Sometimes we want things to happen our way. Sometimes we don't simply want to forgive a hurt or an insult. And sometimes we think that we're yielding by letting go or trying to overlook something. And overlooking is a reasonable way to deal with conflict if we can really overlook it. Sometimes that hurt or the insult comes back to haunt us, and we realize the feelings are still present. And that indicates to us that we actually haven't been able to overlook it. And so then we sometimes wonder why the relationship soured, or why we find that person so annoying. Perhaps it's we who ourselves have not yielded to that inner voice that says, you need to go and speak the truth in love. We avoided confronting an issue and fooled ourselves into thinking we were yielding, but the feelings come back. They're just a way of your heart and your mind and your soul saying to you that you weren't able to yield and overlook it. So you got to plan B, the issue, right? Yielding, giving up our own will for the sake of another, is not an easy thing to do. So when we consider the cosmic yielding that takes place as we walk through the Lenten journey, our spirits can be motivated in profound ways as we seek to pray and to trust and to follow. At least that's what the divine leading that is present doing in the Lenten journey lives out for you and for me. When the voice of heaven uttered, "Let there be," and the Word, St. John says to us, became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. Jesus comes to carry out this greater plan of God, which, as unfolded, seems to be that God willed a painful death. At least that's what the prophet Isaiah tells us about the suffering servant. He writes this, it says, "It was the will of the Lord to crush him." To put himself into human flesh in the person of Jesus, and then put that person through grief. The Lenten journey teaches us that Jesus would die on the cross, bearing in his own body the sins of the world. What is this sin? It means to miss the mark, right? It's like a marksman who goes out with his bow and arrow and he's going to shoot and he's going to try and hit that bullseye. Can he hit the bullseye 100% every single time? No, there's going to be at least a couple times he's going to miss the mark. He's going to have a consequence because he's not perfect. He or she has done what they're designed to do. This body of sin, this body of flesh can't do better sometimes. So it seems that missing the mark has been dealt with different ways over the history and the evolving of people spiritually. As I referred to last week, if you were here, you'll remember that I talked about in the primitive years and the concept of sacrifice. And God made it clear very early on with the story of Isaac that he is not about human sacrifice as the neighboring peoples are. He says basically for now, something like a goat or a lamb will do. And then finally, enough with all the outward sacrifices. Once and for all, God bears self on the cross. This is moving forward with the notion that God is accessible, that God is trustworthy, God is leading souls through some sort of humility, not brute force or strength, but something different. Philippians 2:6 teaches, Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Equality with God wasn't something to be grasped because he's already part of the triune God. He doesn't have to vie for position. can't become more because already a part of everything that exists, but can become less. Empty self, taking on human likeness, yields the right of way to serve our need. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So the worst, the lowest, the point of absolute outrage, that no one could think a God could love to this point. Certainly not gods like Baal or Baal. Certainly not the gods of the Greek Zeus. These all-powerful gods. The living God is something different. God in human flesh, mocked, beaten, nailed to a cross. And then our gospel reading teaches us the night before his death, his prayer, right? Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. If there's another way to accomplish the plan. This human flesh thing sounded really good in the heart of God, but now being lived out requires everything God has to give. Yet even in this cloak of humanity, yields his will and soon would yield his life. Speaking words of intention, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will of the creative forces of the universe be done. Even though he is true God, one with the Father from eternity, Jesus humbles himself and obeys to the greater power of good, yields self even to the point of death, even death on a cross. And with this kind of sacrifice, the biggest thing that you could imagine, the Creator yielding self in Jesus so that we might be able to grasp the sacrifice. The Psalms tell us he desires a broken spirit and a contrite heart, a yielding of the will. The sacrifice has changed from being external to internal. And the sacrifice we make every day is a yielding to God's will for our lives. Jesus' perfect yielding stands in place of our stubborn refusal to yield to God's will. Jesus' perfect obedience stands in place of our disobedience, of our rebellious hearts and our ever-wandering minds. Our stubborn unwillingness to forgive is covered over by Jesus' words of grace as he's nailed to the cross. Father, forgive them. Accomplishing what we call salvation. As he cries out from the cross, it is finished, and yielded up his spirit. So what is this thing, this salvation? Definitions, an act of saving or protecting from harm, risk, loss, or destruction, a state of being saved, protected. It's a source, a cause. Theologically, deliverance from the power of the penalty of sin. Redemption. Deliverance from missing the mark. Deliverance from the consequence of missing the mark. Harm. Ruin. Whatever you perceive it to be, obviously salvation is a good thing. Consequences of missing the mark are mitigated through suffering love, so that our hearts may be transformed and changed. Receiving these are the gifts of salvation. Sometimes on our Lenten journey, it can seem as if Jesus is a victim, which is not at all the case. He's willfully living out the plan of God's suffering love, grace in its highest form, and humanity is delivered. So when you get a delivery from Amazon, what's one of the first things you do? You open it and check it and make sure it's not broken, right? We are the ones delivered, unbroken, unharmed, safe, while the deliverer is completely broken. And this is the life force that is at work in you. We're not here to accomplish our own salvation. That's already been done. We get to receive the gifts of our salvation. We get to be able to pray, to communicate with God. We get to be able to trust the will that is better than anything we could plan out. We get to be able to follow because it is life to the full. And when we find ourselves praying as Jesus taught, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," a reminder, a calling upon all that is holy to help us yield our sometimes stubborn and selfish human will to God's greater good, forgiving others as we have been forgiven. That's at the heart of what God enables us to do, which on our own, of our own strength, we usually cannot do for ourselves. The Lenten journey is to be a reminder of this characteristic of God at work in us, about praying and trusting and following, knowing this power is at work in us and all people can accomplish what we could never muster the strength to accomplish on our own. The strength of the universe is humble strength, yet all-powerful strength, who reminds us where our strength comes from. The words of Psalm 121, where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. That's something. That's someone to yield the right of way to. Because God has yielded his entire being for our good, so that we may trust what is in the best interests for you and for me and for the entire world, so that we may trust and thus we may follow, which is to live out the joy of our salvation.